1980s and 90s, he's been in and out of prison. In a letter he penned to St. Joseph County investigators in 1991, James wrote that one of his former cellmates confessed to the Lakeville murders. According to handwritten letters I have copies of, James's story goes like this. In early 1988, James got a new cellmate who went by the name Dave. Just Dave, no last name. Dave told James that he was in prison for stealing a box truck filled with furniture and transporting it over state lines. Before being arrested, Dave, his wife, and their kids were transients in South Bend, Indiana, and ran out of money. They were told to visit a local pastor. When they did, the Reverend gave the family a $100 check. But the money quickly dried up, and Dave and his wife got into a fight. He hit her, and she ran back to the pastor for help. The pastor got the police involved, and eventually Dave was busted with a truck full of stolen goods. Dave vowed to James that when he was released, he would, quote, get back at the pastor and blow him off the face of the earth, end quote. Fast forward to a year later, summer 1989. According to James, Dave had made parole at the beginning of the year, and James himself was out of prison too. The two men met up near an interstate in Ohio and shared dinner and a motel room. That's when James says Dave confessed to murdering a family of 4 in Indiana in April. James said Dave explained how he used a 12-gauge shotgun to shoot all 4 victims in the head, including 2 young girls he chased into a downstairs game room. When their mother came down screaming, Dave said he'd shot her too. Dave also told James that he'd shot a man upstairs and stepped over his body and shot him a second time when he tried to get up. Dave told James he'd stolen a 35mm camera, a bag of coins, and a wristwatch from the family's house. So, this scenario sounds a lot like the Pelly murders, right? Maybe, but I'm always wary of jailhouse confessions. James wrote several more letters to Indiana police in the early 1990s about this Dave friend of his being the family's killer. But the problem was, his information was not credible. For example, James doesn't even know the full name of his old cellmate, Dave. Then there's the obvious details that don't fit with the crime scene. Like when James states Dave told him he used a 12-gauge shotgun in the murders. Well, we know from the autopsies and evidence inside the Pelly parsonage that a 20-gauge was used. One thing I noticed from news media reports published in the early days of the Pelly murder investigation was that news outlets often incorrectly reported that a 12-gauge was used in the crime. So, if it's a scenario where James is making up his story, that's why he says a 12-gauge was used, not a 20-gauge. Because he's basing his details on info that's been misreported in the news. There's also times in James's letters that he says Dave described the little girls as wearing long white nightgowns when he killed them. That too is just not possible. I've seen the crime scene photos of the dead Pelly girls. They were in tank tops and shorts, not nightgowns. There's also no way Dave stole a 35mm camera because that was collected as evidence from the parsonage. Needless to say, St. Joseph County detectives didn't give James Chapman much credit. His information wasn't considered legit, but they couldn't write him off entirely, so they took what he said, filed his letters away, and kept moving along. In 1991, Detective John Bowditch was still convinced that Jeff Pelly was the person who killed Bob, Dawn, Janelle, and Jolene. In the 2 years since the slayings, he'd had some odd interactions with Jeff in Lakeville.
I probably interviewed Jeff 20, 25 times. If I was outside of my house, which is just outside of Lakeville, Jeff was driving by because he ended up moving to an apartment in Lakeville. He stopped by my house. Hey John, how you doing? Good, Jeff, how are you? Hey, I got a job, I'm working at this place, I'm selling knives, or I'm thinking about doing this vacuum cleaner thing, what do you think about that? You know, and people say, and I tell people this, you know, if you knew I was the lead investigator on a case where your mother, your stepmother, your father, and your 2 stepsisters all got killed, would there be one question you would ever ask me? Even if you hated your stepmother and your stepsisters. did you ever find out who killed my dad? Never. He never asked that. I'd go see him at his apartment. And that was kind of freaky because some of the furniture he had in there was the furniture was in the basement of that house.
Sometime in late 1990, Jeff moved from Indiana back to Cape Coral, Florida. He was about to turn 20 years old and wanted to make a fresh start. He took a job working in a credit bureau business in Fort Myers, which was owned by a longtime family friend who attended First Church of the Nazarene when Jeff was growing up. The leader of that family was a prominent Fort Myers businessman named Philip Hawley. Phil had 5 sons, Pierre, Danny, Paul, David, and Martin, all roughly close to Jeff's age. After moving to Indiana, Jeff stayed close friends with the Hawleys, especially Martin, who was a classmate of his from Cape Coral High School. In May 1989, Martin was actually interviewed by the Fort Myers News Press, reacting to the murders of the Pelly family. He was 16 when he spoke to the reporter and said, quote, "It doesn't seem realistic. Their family life hasn't gone very well," end quote. According to the report, Martin told the newspaper that he was in Chicago the weekend the Pellys were killed and was heartbroken for his friend, Jeff. In the wake of the crimes and Jeff returning to Fort Myers, the Hawley family didn't just give Jeff a job, they took him under their wing. Jeff thrived working for Phil's business, chasing payments for delinquent accounts and collecting commissions. He'd basically become part of the Hawley family, and even married one of Phil's nieces, a woman named Kim. Things were looking up, until all of a sudden, they weren't.
Whether you're splitting the cost of a road trip with the guys, paying the dog walker, or sending birthday money to your favorite cousin, Zelle is a great way to send money to family and friends, no matter where they bank in the U.S. Plus, money goes straight into the recipient's bank account, typically in minutes between enrolled users, and you probably won't have to download another app, because Zelle is already in over 1,400 different banking apps. Look for Zelle in your banking app today.